Welcome to the Consulting Leaders Podcast, where we talk about the business of consulting. Whether you're looking to grow your practice or learn from the stories of leaders in consulting, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Guillaume Jouvencel, ex-PwC and co-founder of GHA Marketing. Join me as I interview the best consultants in their niche. Let's get on with the show.
Welcome to Consulting Leaders Podcast, a place where we talk about the business of consulting. Whether you're looking to grow your own practice or learn from the stories of leaders in consulting, you're in the right place. I'm your host, John Degnan. Join me as we talk with the best consultants in their niche. Today, we welcome Steve Dennis, a globally recognized retail strategist, best-selling author, and former Fortune 500 executive helping brands navigate disruption and drive sustainable growth. Here, we're going to unpack how he attracts, converts, and retains high-level advisory clients and what consultants can learn from his approach. Steve, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
No problem. Tell us more about yourself.
Oh, boy. Well, I often say what a long, strange trip it's been, but in some ways it's fairly linear. From a professional standpoint, I've spent most of my career in retail, not entirely. I did a few things early on, worked for a big consulting firm, worked in CPG for a little while, but really since the early 90s, I've worked exclusively in and around retail. First part of my career, or really like the first 2/3 of it, was on the executive leadership side. So I worked my way up through to the executive team of a couple retailers, big retailers. And then I have been out on my own doing consulting, which eventually morphed into writing, podcasting, speaking for quite a bit now.
How did you transition from retail to consulting?
I'd love to tell you it was super deliberate. I mean, there was a little bit of intention behind it in that I worked with a career consultant like in 2003. And one of the things we talked about was my long-term vision. And I said at that time that I thought I would want to stay in the corporate world, try to work my way up in big organizations for probably another 10 years or so. But then I kind of had this idea that maybe I would write and speak and be on boards, those kinds of things. I ended up, when I was at Neiman Marcus, where I was on the senior leadership team running strategy and some other things, I ended up getting really burned out, having some personal stuff. So I just decided to step out of that role and take some time off, not really sure what I was going to do. And then the global financial crisis hit, and I was like, what should I do next? Because the job prospects weren't great, and we were going to stay in Dallas, and so that was also limiting. So I thought, what could I do to leverage my skills that wasn't going back to the corporate grind and do it from where I was living and where my kids were in school? And so I kind of backed into consulting, honestly. And then as I got a little bit of traction and started to find that was more interesting to me, I've stuck with it. I mean, it's morphed quite a bit for me, but it's been a while now.
And what's your consulting niche?
I work in and around retail pretty much. Like I said, I've done few different things along the way. But I work for retailers, I work for retail investors, I work for retail technology companies, sometimes it's in the real estate world. But it's all, the epicenter of that, I guess, is all tied back to retail. I focus on strategy, innovation, navigating disruption, so pretty much exclusively working at the senior leadership level. And I would say at this point, and maybe we get into this a little bit more how it evolved, but I'm doing more board work, more executive coaching and navigating change or catalyzing change through speaking workshops and those kinds of things. I don't do a lot of what I would consider kind of traditional consulting projects with a statement of work and and competition and all that kind of stuff. So that is partially how it's evolved on its own, and it's partially a deliberate choice.
When you step into a company today, what's the core transformation challenge you're helping leaders solve, and why is that problem so important for you personally?
Well, I would say the most consistent thing, at least on the retailer side, not necessarily so much working with technology companies or investors, is most of them are not changing fast enough, and they're not changing their value proposition significantly enough. It's what I call, aiming higher in the value you deliver and moving faster, fundamentally being bolder. And as we've seen, and I think this is true, I imagine it's true, at least outside of retail, the pace of change continues to accelerate. It's much more exponential than linear in a lot of cases. And so what I see quite a lot is that companies are doing a lot of incremental things, or they just don't realize how at risk they're becoming by not moving faster and aiming higher. So I would say that's the most common change, and that's really the focus of my most recent book. I guess related to that is they keep going back to the well with, kind of what got you here isn't going to get you there sort of idea, that the things that have worked to make them successful in the past really don't have as much relevance in a lot of cases. So it's really reframing their mindset. And it's hard to find, I would say, from a marketing standpoint, intersecting with companies at the right time, because the companies that realize that have moved ahead, they don't need me. The companies that are really unaware, I guess, I'm probably not the right guy because I'm going to be in their face too much. So, trying to intersect with companies at the right period of time and where they're not likely to hire McKinsey or Bain or, somebody who's got a really, really different consulting business than I do.
You mentioned your book. It's called Leaders Leap, bestseller. Tell us more about it.
Well, it's a little bit of a diversion. So my first book, Remarkable Retail, which I think is the best-selling retail strategy book of the last decade, one of the things I really didn't get to in that book was more, what's the leadership challenge? Remarkable Retail was more a case for change and a methodology, a framework to make strategic change. But one of the things that was coming up for me, and I realized as I look back at my experience, particularly on the corporate side, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't say it directly, but I started my career at Sears, which at the time I joined was the second biggest retailer on the planet. And I imagine most of your listeners know basically it doesn't exist anymore. So having lived through a good chunk of the, how do you go from being this iconic, super successful retailer to a non-entity, I've lived through that, and I have a certain amount of PTSD, I guess, about that. But as I got out in the consulting world and as an analyst and writer and speaker, one of the things I see a lot is not so much that executives don't know what to do. In some cases, that's the challenge. But a lot of times, it's their limited thinking and their ego and fear that gets in the way. So what I wanted to tackle is kind of sit in between, imagine some of your audience would know these people, where Clayton Christensen was with the Innovator's Dilemma, which is more academic and strategic, and where Brene Brown on kind of courageous leadership sits, and try to get at that intersection, because that's where I see lots of organizations and lots of leaders in particular get hung up. So yeah, it was a personal interest for me. It's got a lot of retail examples, but it's definitely a general industry book. I think it's any organizations that are dealing with transforming at the speed of disruption, which is the subtitle, I think it would be relevant for.
Okay. Your work is very driven by thought leadership, books, speaking, podcasting. How has that shaped the way or opportunities come to you today?
Well, it's definitely evolved. I didn't start out that way. I'll tell you quickly kind of my journey. So as I mentioned, when I got started, kind of backed into it, but I had a number of people reach out to me about my potentially doing some work for them. So I started down that path, but then I realized one of the things coming out of the corporate world was nobody knew who I was. And if they knew who I was, they didn't know me as a consultant. So I started doing a lot of blogging, which eventually led to becoming a Forbes contributor. And really that was marketing for me. It's not a way to make much money, but part of it was to grow awareness that I was out there and try to have a point of view that perhaps would get people interested in what I was doing. I started to get some speaking inquiries. In fact, I'll tell you a very quick story that I think is funny, whether anybody else will find it funny, but I had an executive from Nike reach out to me who was reading my blog. Unbeknownst to me, it wasn't somebody I knew. And she said, "Oh, we're having this big management offsite in a few months, and we'd love to have a kickoff speaker. Do you do any speaking?" And I hope Heidi's not listening, because I said yes, even though I hadn't really done any speaking, but I figured I could figure it out. But anyway, that led me to have to come up with something to present rather than these isolated pieces of writing. And that got me more interested in thinking about, well, aside from just being known and having not random thoughts, but sort of scattered thoughts, is there a framework, methodology that drives my work and gets people motivated to change? So that's really what led me to write Remarkable Retail, and that led to me pursuing speaking more aggressively. So a lot of that was really, I started to think about how I wanted to make change happen. And of course, one way of doing that is to do projects for clients and be embedded in that change. The other way is to reach a lot of people and try to motivate them to change without me being directly involved. And so I made a pretty conscious change that I thought that by doing more writing, more speaking, and then eventually a podcast and another book, that not only could it be good marketing for me, but also it would create change more at scale where I wasn't, directly involved with that. So it was really a fundamental shift for me. And I decided, well, if I'm going to go in that direction, I have to get serious about it and really invest more time, and hired a speaking coach. And I did a bunch of things to really get better at that piece of my business.
You built a successful podcast in your space, the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Right.
What role do you think podcasting plays for consultants who want to build authority?
I think a couple ways. I mean, one is, maybe three. I always, say there's usually three. I start with two and then I pivot to three. One is it could definitely expand your audience. The challenge, I think, now in the podcasting world, I mean, we've been at it coming up on 6 years, just past 300 episodes. So when we started, it was a less crowded space. And my co-host and producer, Michael LeBlanc, had a fair amount of experience in podcasts. So I think it was a less crowded space to be able, I think what we do is good and we've done well with it, but I think it was a little easier to build an audience. I think it's a lot harder right now. I mean, several of the podcasts I know that I would say are competitors of us, they're lucky if they get 100 downloads. So,
interesting.
And then those 100 downloads are not necessarily people that would be good prospects, right? It just make people that, like what you're doing. So I think it's a hard space, but if you can build it, one, it definitely helps my thinking, and as we think about the editorial focus we're going to take and how we're going to communicate the ideas, that is helpful. Just like my Substack newsletter is helpful to my thinking. It also allows somebody to hear you, get a sense of your personality more than a written piece would be, and you can reach people in a way that would be different than doing a speech at a conference. So I think it'd be very helpful in elevating your thought leadership, or using it as, hey, you want to hear what I think about this topic? Listen to this podcast. But that's really, I think, the same way a book can work. Book's a more complete view of your ideas. Podcasts a little episodic. Newsletters a little episodic. Blog posts a little episodic. Speech is kind of a different thing. So I think it would be important. I just, what I say to a lot of people now that I talk to, whether they're consultants or just other people that want to get into the podcast world, it's difficult. It takes time to do it well. It takes time to stay on top of the content. We have guests about 2/3 of the time, so we're always chasing guests. We're very particular about how we have on. We're almost exclusively founders and CEOs at retailers. And consistency is important. I know some people that do podcast episodes, fairly infrequently, and I think it's hard to build an audience, but it does take a lot of time to do it, as you know. So,
absolutely.
So I think it could be important. I just think it's really challenging to, kind of be the signal amid the noise now. And it's very helpful to me. I have a big following, relatively speaking, on social media. So it's kind of like, well, if you get so many people, maybe 1 or 2% of the people will buy your book. Maybe 1 or 2% of those people will listen to your podcast. And if you only have 1,000 followers, then, that's 10 people, right? So it's kind of hard to say, oh, that's really driving my business. And it's a great lead magnet, right? So.
Sure. When you engage with a leadership team, what does your process look like to move from insight to actual transformation?
These days it's more, it depends a little bit the sort of assignment I'm doing. If I'm doing more advisory work on retainer, all of it, I guess, is fairly customized. I don't have so much of a process. I used to use my 8 Essentials of Remarkable framework more, I still do sometimes. And so if I am using that framework, which is spelled out in my first book, then usually I'm doing some sort of audit against the 8 essentials to try to understand, okay, where are the areas that we really need to focus on, and kind of like a maturity model almost, and say, okay, if we're going to focus on these 2 essentials. These are the areas of opportunity. And then usually there's some sort of data gathering or interviewing of the management team. I facilitate strategic planning sessions. I've got a way I generally approach that I start with, and then I'm usually collecting data, and then I synthesize it. So most of what I do is relatively customized, I guess, but I definitely have some tools I lean on.
Your work is largely referral driven. What do you think makes clients come back and continue to trust you over time?
Well, it's probably a little bit more accurate to say it's more inbound driven. Like, I don't do a lot of outbound. So there is referral, but oftentimes it's people reaching out to me, and that's partially because I don't think I'm particularly good at business development, at least traditional business development. So, who knows? I might have done a lot better if I spent more time on that. But one of the things that's been very helpful to me, probably a little bit more on the speaking and kind of media side, less traditional consulting, is when I got to a certain level of, being like mini famous within the space, then, well, maybe in a second I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the mindset I had in doing that. But it just kind of builds on each other. You speak at a certain conference, then you get bigger conferences, or you work with certain clients, and then you get other clients. So I don't know that I had a real elaborate plan or sales and marketing strategy, other than I did have a goal of, how do I get to be one of the top retail thought leaders over a period of time? And so a lot of what I did was, I'm going to speak for free. I'm going to go on podcasts for free. I'm just going to be out there. And it took 2 or 3 years to, if not longer, to go from, relative unknown or somebody with a nice following to someone who is showing up on lists and getting invited into certain spaces. So, but a friend of mine who's a very successful author and speaker, not in the retail space, he said to me when I was early in my speaking career, he said, well, the first thing you got to do is kind of meet the spec. So if somebody's looking for somebody to give an opening keynote on retail trends or whatever it is, how are you a credible person? Do you have the expertise? Do you have a keynote that works? Are you very credible, at least if somebody's going to Google you, that you show up as somebody who's at least worth listening to? I said, so that's the first level of success, and that will get you certain fees and get you into certain places. Then you'll know you're really doing it when people ask for you. So I say that because I've been very focused on an idea that I borrowed from a guy named Rashad Tobacawala, which is defining your niche, owning your voice, and having a very clear story. So you are moving more to a segment of one. Now it's a little bit egoic to say it like that, but I've been very focused on how do I build that brand, that personal brand, and being very specific about it and pretty intentional about how to do it. A lot of that, though, is circuitous. I tried a lot of stuff. A bunch of things didn't work. So that's why I say I don't know that I can give anybody a real playbook for doing that. And it's somewhat risky, for sure, because I stopped doing some things in order to put more time into it. But it did get to a point where I had several years where I made more money speaking than I did consulting. So I had a certain amount of success with that. But it's a very narrow audience or very narrow market. So I don't know that I would advise that for everybody as a strategy. And I'm fortunate that I didn't have to do work for the most part. I didn't have to do work I didn't want to do just for the money. So, I appreciate, I'm in my 60s now. I'm not grinding away at the way I did earlier in my career. So, I'm very privileged in that way to not have to scramble as much as I did 10 or 15 years ago when I was just getting started.
Any more books on the horizon?
Well, probably. I had, if you had talked to me 6 weeks ago, I would have said I'm done. In fact, if you probably talked to me 6 days ago, I probably would have said it, but I'm not ready to announce a new book, but I am playing around with a specific idea. But one thing I'll say about writing a book, I mean, there's a lot I'm sure we could talk about there. We don't necessarily have the time to get into, but one of the things I realized, and I would say this is something for a lot of consultants to think about, is one of the advantages of blogging or doing a podcast or just putting content out into the world is, at least for me, is it gets me to the point, or it gets me practice of playing with ideas. And that sometimes leads to conversations that makes the ideas better. And with my first book in particular, I wrote, 800 blog posts or something like that. Not all of them were directly related to the book, but I was able to find my way to this bigger idea through writing a lot of those individual pieces and doing consulting work and speaking. So a lot of times I would say to people, get out of your head and just start putting some stuff out there, because I think you need the practice. And to me, those ideas come over time. So part of the reason why I'm maybe going to start on this new book was I was doing a bunch of writing of smaller pieces and stuff started to connect for me. I don't know if I just sat on a mountain or sat in my office for several hours and just said, right, I mean, I don't know how musicians do it. Go and write a hit song, right? So anyway, for me, that's, I getting back to kind of what I knew how to do better a few years ago. I had a little bit different process on Leaders Leap. So anyway, I don't know. I'm not sure what's the takeaway there, other than if you really want to be seen as a thought leader in your space, I think you have to have the courage to put some stuff out there before it's ready. And I do know that I talk to a lot of people and I do a little bit of executive coaching. And a lot of times I see perfectionism take hold and people are afraid to put out things because they're just polishing and polishing and polishing it. And, and I say that as a recovering perfectionist. So consult and heal thyself, because I still absolutely struggle with some of that. But I also have found a certain point, I don't know if there's a quote that maybe or some people in the audience know from the producer of Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels, who says the show doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30. And that's something I've tried to live up to, because, we're never really ready. And so anyway, I just have to put a lot of stuff out there, and some of it works and some of it doesn't, but mostly I do it because it leads to other things. And I think if you're really going to elevate yourself in whatever space, subsector you're in, it's noisy. And so part of what I think you need to do is really be clear on who's it for, who are the 1,000 true fans you're trying to build in your work? How do you find that unique voice? And I do think it's also in a world of AI, there's a lot of thought leaders putting stuff out that's very obviously written by AI. And I use AI. I'm not a Luddite. I use AI. So I'm not saying don't do it. But I think what really works, if you're going to be really more dominant in your space, is to build that authority. And I think the authority is, narrowing your focus on the customers you want to have, being very clear about how you add value, and then make it uniquely your own. And I don't think many of us are born with that talent. So some of that is intention, a lot of it is practice, and then it's the courage, I think, to go out on a limb a little bit, because that's where the interesting work happens, right? It's a bit of a cliche, but I see a lot of folks just are doing, very decent work, but it's just not that special. It's not that remarkable. So, and with AI coming, I think it's going to be very easy for some of the work that consultants have historically done to either not be there, or to be half the price or narrower in scope, which leads to it being cheaper, and therefore you need more projects. And so I think that creates a lot of dilemmas. So I think part of the way you solve for it is really figure out, I always say, part of what I say in Remarkable Retail is, it's not interesting to say you have to have a unique value proposition and be relevant. That has been very true. What's different is in an infinite world of choices where people can move very easily, you truly have to aim higher in the value you deliver.
Finally, Steve, looking ahead, where do you see the biggest opportunity for helping companies become remarkable over the next few years?
Well, I think largely because of technology, and I don't want to make this all about AI because it's not just about AI, but I think that there's a commoditization. I mean, there's always been commodity, there's always been a race to efficiency. And I think it's a little bit what I was just saying. I mean, I think for a lot of companies, if sometimes in retail, I say there's been a bit of a fork in the road where you have all these companies like Amazon and Walmart that are, massive scale, about value and convenience. And if you're not the low cost provider that's just amazing at technology, you have no chance of winning. And then there are those retailers that are more special, more experiential, whatever you want to call it. And everybody in the middle is getting wiped out or struggling. And so I think that's only going to become more profound. So I think it's about really picking a lane. And, most of us are not going to be able to keep pace with what Amazon and Walmart, Costco, a few others are doing. So where does the value, it's always been important to say, where's the value added? But I think because of the ubiquity of technology, you need to work with agentic AI, but there's going to be a point where agentic AI is like a fax machine, right? So I think really getting clear on where the value is added and be willing to experiment more. And so that's the thing when I'm talking to retailers now, I'm saying like, best practices is kind of an old idea. Like by the time you get to a best practice, then the world has moved on and moving faster and faster. So how are you going to uniquely add value? How can you own a space? So I think that's advice for consultants. That's advice for corporations, companies, founders, whatever, that I think, it's very challenging to stay on top of it. And it does require probably a different relationship to risk. The last thing I'll say, got back to my book, one of the ideas I talk about is this idea that safe is risky. And I think that, a lot of times that incremental change has been what has made companies successful. It's just kind of optimizing. But as it gets harder and harder to stand out, you have to be able to take more risk. But, that means you may not work. So you have to be agile enough, I guess, to respond to it. But that is definitely one of the things that I go into with clients, which is like, what's really their relationship to risk? Are they wired to say yes? Are they wired to say no? Do they mostly spend time defending the status quo, or are they really trying a lot of new ideas? So yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to stay on top of all this stuff because things are moving.
Sure is.
So quickly. Sure is. So that's the thing that kind of keeps me up at night, or where I'm just like, wow, how deep do I want to go into some of this stuff? Because I'm never going to be an expert on a lot of these new technologies, and it's exhausting to try to keep pace. So I feel the challenges for anybody in the service business, but I feel the challenges for people on the client side as well, because things just change so much more quickly than they did, even 3 or 4 years ago, I think.
Steve, great talk. Where do we find you? Where can we see you? What will you do? Your links and your websites and your LinkedIns.
Probably the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn, so Steve Dennis. But I have a website, which is Stephen P. Dennis, Stephen with a V.com, and the Remarkable Retail Podcast. So I usually say I'm not that hard to find because I'm a relentless self-promoter. So it's not too shy about that. Probably a little too much sometimes, but you can always unsubscribe. Okay.
We'll put all the links in the description. Thank you so much for coming on Consulting Leaders, Steve. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Like I said, thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Leaders Podcast. We hope you learned valuable lessons on how to grow your practice and take your business to the next level. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening to this show so you never miss an episode. To apply and be a guest on the show, click the link in the description. See you next time.